Government spending is out of control, and the only option Congress is probably considering is cutting programs like Social Security, SSI, SSDI, SNAP, and Medicare. Hear it straight from billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller.
So I was actually happy to see when the announcement, the support for Ukraine and Israel, $106 billion. And I was waiting to hear what the offset was going to be. Was it going to be entitlements? Where were the cuts going to be? And the next thing I knew, 2 days later, there was not only no offset, there was $56 trillion in emergency spending. I have kids, I have grandkids. Child care is not emergency spending. It's a priority that maybe should be on the table or not, but we are spending like drunken sailors, okay? So
do you agree with the House Republican plan, which puts forth spending for Israel but cuts it in the IRA through funding to the IRS? Is that an appropriate offset in your mind?
Becky, I want to go after entitlements. It's where the money is, and
you're not going to solve this.
At some point, it's going to happen. I'm going to give you some numbers to tell you why.
Do that. Yeah.
It's going to happen no matter what.
You heard it straight from Stanley Druckenmiller. You know, guys, I, as an average person, saw interest rates so low, so I refinanced my car, refinanced my primary residence, my rental properties to a much lower rate in order to save money. And these government officials making big bucks didn't realize that. Or maybe they just didn't give a rat's behind about saving money for the American people. Maybe it's as simple as that. Like you heard, Stanley Druckenmiller said that the federal government has been spending recklessly and failed to issue debt at low rates in past years. Mistakes that will ultimately lead to some tough choices in the future, like cutting Social Security. He mentioned that White House trying to get another $56 billion in emergency spending for disaster relief and childcare programs, in addition to the $106 billion that the administration wants for Israel and Ukraine. To offset runaway spending, Druckenmiller said government entitlement programs, which make up almost half of the federal budget, could be pared down in the future. More specifically, he proposed a cut in Social Security benefits. His argument, this generation has got to take a cut. Right now, current seniors, you're going to get 100 cents on the dollar. Future seniors looking at 5 or 10 cents on the dollar is not unreasonable for us to go to 85 or 90 cents on the dollar. I bet our Social Security fan watching this right now has something to say about that. As a result, Druckenmiller believes that the market will be very challenged in the current environment and only disciplined stock pickers would be rewarded. Me? I just want to point out something that I've been thinking about lately. Have any of you noticed that every time there's a huge economic recession, depression, we always go to war? Is it just a coincidence? I'm gonna let you guys answer that one. Make sure you guys are always updated. Hit the subscribe button and tap that notification bell. I thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you guys watching our channel and always lighting up the like button. It means a lot to me. It really does. So thank you. Another critic of government spending is Senator Rand Paul. His warning to everybody who will listen: the government's out of control spending is threatening the very existence of the US dollar and even the country. According to Senator Paul, they'll bankrupt our country in sending money everywhere all over the planet. I think some of our viewers can agree with that. He also mentioned how this is probably the greatest threat to our national security, if that's what we're thinking that we're supposed to do, to protect our national security. The greatest threat to it is national debt. We borrowed $1 trillion in the last 3 months alone. That's a lot of money, you guys. Hence, out of control government spending, and as Senator Paul put it, we are threatening the very existence of our currency and perhaps our country by this crazy profligate spending. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Is our government spending too much? Let me know your thoughts. Other notable people sounding the same alarm as Senator Rand Paul: JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, billionaire bond king Jeffrey Gundlach, and well-known investor Jim Rogers. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon recently said he is worried about the U.S. economy because the fiscal money being spent is so big, the largest in peacetime ever, with very high deficits and QT we've never had. He also warned we could possibly be in the most dangerous time the world has seen in decades. It definitely feels that way to me. Just last month, billionaire bond king Jeffrey Gundlach said that the future of the US dollar and possibly out of control inflation depends on getting the budget and spending under control. Economist and gold bug Peter Schiff predicted a full-blown financial crisis and a U.S. dollar crisis as the national debt spirals out of control. Then there's global financial services firm Jefferies talking about the potential collapse of the US dollar. And of course, let's not forget about famous investor Jim Rogers has warned that the era of US dollar dominance is ending, with the Chinese yuan as the sole contender to replace the USD. All big names in the finance world are saying the same thing here, that we've got to get this government spending under control. As United States citizens, we the people have a right to know what's going on, right guys? I mean, the US national debt is sitting at beyond $33 trillion. According to OECD data, as a percentage of the debt to GDP, the country with the highest level of national debt in 2022 was Japan at 255%. The United States ranked fourth behind Greece and Italy. And just to really bring it home for you guys, every year since 2001, the US government has spent more money than it takes in, which means it has to borrow more money to make up for the difference. They say that debt has many useful purposes. The public debt has always been used for emergencies. It's easier to finance by borrowing than to burden the current generation with taxes. So does that mean that we've been in emergency status since 2001? I'm gonna let you guys think about that one. More recently though, the national debt increased by more than 89% since the beginning of the pandemic, with many top economists in agreement that 2020 was not the time to worry about debt. But now that the worst of the public health emergency has passed, the focus is back on how the ever-expanding debt can be harmful to the economy. The national debt experts make a very good point. Their concern is not whether the national debt should ever be used. It should be how it's used and how much it's used. And unfortunately, we're using it for rainy days and sunny days right now. Economists measure the severity of a nation's debt based on its debt to GDP ratio. The U.S. debt held by the public is nearly at 100%. The Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board says a responsible debt to GDP ratio for a country the size of the U.S. would be 70%. You see what I mean? Sure, debt helps your economy because you can take on large initiatives like infrastructure. You can take on crises like the pandemic, but like the experts say, you have to watch where your debt to GDP ratio is because that really is the stability indicator of whether you can actually service this debt or whether you're tilting the balance. Especially now, servicing debt can become difficult when interest rates are higher, and the Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates since March of 2022 with the goal of slowing down economic activity. Some are making the most of it, saying that servicing the debt at high interest rates can actually stimulate the economy. Basically, the Fed is pushing up interest rates, and this is feeding hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in additional income to bondholders. So people who are holding government bonds paying higher rates of interest are getting a huge windfall in the form of interest income, and that income can be spent just like any other form of income. Debt rises when the U.S. spends more than it earns from taxes and other revenue. The public debt results from tax and spending policies that commonly garner public support. But individuals often worry about how the national debt affects their lives and their finances. So really guys, what does the national debt mean for you and average Americans? Again, the federal government runs a budget deficit whenever spending exceeds tax collections and other revenue. To make up the difference, the U.S. Treasury sells Treasury bills, T-notes, T-bills, notes, and bonds. The national debt is the combination of the federal government's annual budget deficits minus surpluses. When you look at U.S. history, the debt to GDP ratio tends to rise during recessions and in the aftermath. GDP shrinks during a recession while government tax receipts go down and safety net spending rises. So, the combination of higher budget deficits with lower GDP inflates the debt to GDP ratio. You know, when we go through deep recessions like the ones in the 1980s and 2008 through 2009, they can have some pretty serious and lasting effects on the national debt. I mean, we saw some massive debt spending in significant historical events in the U.S., like overseas borrowing to finance the American Revolution, tax cuts and spending increases advocated by President Ronald Reagan grew the GDP ratio by 52% by 1990. The fallout from the Great Recession saw the debt to GDP ratio rise from 64% in 2008 to 100% by 2012. And most recently, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic raised the debt to GDP ratio from 107% in late 2019 to 135% by mid-2020. It declined to 119% as of Q1 2023. So how does all of this debt affect you? People often compare government debt to personal debt to express their concerns about its size. But there's a crucial difference. A family can't print their own money like the US government can. What really matters isn't just how much debt we have or how it compares to our country's GDP, but how we use that borrowed money. Let's talk about the paradox of thrift. Sometimes when people try to save more money individually, it can actually have the opposite effect when you look at the big picture. It's not a paradox to understand why governments, when they adopt fiscal austerity and cut spending, can end up causing more significant economic downturns, leading to even bigger deficits and ultimately more debt. Dealing with debt and the cost of servicing that debt forces policymakers to make some tough choices. And remember, how we use the money we borrow can be more important than the amount of debt we take on and how it compares to our country's GDP. For instance, during the COVID-19 crisis, many Americans supported government spending for pandemic relief while opposing cuts to expensive government programs. They also feel like they're paying too much in federal income taxes, but are increasingly open to raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy. When the government borrows money and invests it in ways that boost the economy's potential, it could pay off in the long run, or it might not. Really, it's all about how the money is put to use. There's also such thing as a modern monetary theory. And so basically, this modern monetary theory means that governments do not rely on taxes or borrowing for spending since they can print as much money as they need. You know, there are economists, even those who believe in this theory, who point out that the amount of debt held by the US government doesn't always mirror the saving choices of the investors buying those government bonds. This includes central banks from countries that have trade surpluses with the US, as well as US corporations and households. National debt, you see, often gets people riled up in the political space, particularly when it starts to approach that congressionally set debt ceiling, which is going to happen in just a few days, mind you. It's a real nail biter for politicians and financial markets because they have to grapple with the scary thought of the United States, the US as we know it, possibly defaulting on its debt if the debt ceiling isn't increased. Definitely something to pick up for our next update. Make sure you guys tune in.